Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the CARES Conference 2020. I'm Chris Morris, and I'm the manager of Local Energy Scotland, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone from myself and the rest of the team at Local Energy Scotland. Our conference takes place on the second day of Scotland's Climate Week, and our theme this year is Community Climate Action, and we tried to focus on that throughout our conference content. As you'll be aware, we find ourselves in really difficult times. We are in a climate and energy crisis, and arguably an economic crisis. We recognise the extraordinary pressure that everybody is facing in the face of unprecedented energy price, and we know that, you know, if not all of you here, many of you will have concerns not only about household bills, but about your community buildings, your businesses and your local services. I've worked in Scottish energy efficiency and renewable energy projects for almost 25 years now, and currently it does feel pretty overwhelming. And whilst we recognise that these things are really difficult, we are going to focus today on the actions that communities are taking and those that they can take. And we'll be focusing on climate action that supports people and communities. It's great to see so many people here today. It's been nice watching the names coming in, a lot of them very familiar and a lot who are new to CARES as well. And over the day, we're expecting around 200 people to be registered and to participate over the day. And I'm really excited about the content for today's conference, and I'll just talk you through that briefly. So I'm going to carry on and talk a little bit about CARES after the welcome and the introduction, and just share some of the stories and highlight how CARES may help you to act. Following that, we'll move into a panel discussion, and my colleague Kirsty will be joined by Professor Janette Web, Professor Tahseen Jafry and Sue Kearns. And really this session is going to focus on, well, what are those global issues impacting us, and then trying to focus that onto, well, what does that mean to us locally, and what does that mean in terms of local action? Following our panel discussion, we're delighted to have Mr. Harvie, who's the Minister for Zero Carbon Buildings, Active Travels and Tenants Rights. He's going to make an address, do the keynote speech, but he's staying on for a while afterwards, and there'll be time to ask him questions. So please have your questions ready to put them to him. Following Mr. Harvie's presentation, we'll break for lunch. We have got quite a long lunch because we recognise it's quite a long time in front of the screen and give you a chance to get away. In the afternoon, we're going to look at some of the key skills and actions needed to drive change in your communities, and we've called these our how-to sessions. And you'll see on the slide we've got these split into two blocks. We've got the first block starting at 1:30, and then the second block at 2:45. I know you selected blocks, but please do feel free to attend the one you're most interested in either of the blocks, and you've got the sign-up links in the email we send to you for them. There's a 15-minute break between the two. Finally, at the end of the day, we've got a CARES funding surgery from 4 o'clock, and we really hope this will be useful for those who are kind of ready to think about starting their project or have some specific questions. And we'll break into smaller groups with our fantastic development officers and give you that opportunity to think about what the next steps might be for climate action in your community. In terms of housekeeping, I kind of feel many of you will be too familiar with Teams and online meetings after 2 years of pandemic, but I will give you a quick reminder. Please could you keep your microphones and cameras off in these sessions. We'd really love questions from you, particularly for the panel discussion and the keynote speech today. And I've just on the slide, I've shown two buttons that you should be able to see across the top of Teams. One is the chat, and if you click on that, that's where you can post questions, and the other is reactions, so you can react to things as things go on, and we'd really encourage you to ask questions and use the chat facility for that. We are recording the morning session in full. The how-to sessions in the afternoon will record the first bit, but all the Q&A and the discussion parts won't be recorded. We want everybody to feel comfortable participating and contributing and speaking during them. There's a few of our speakers who are in remote locations, so please be patient if there are any issues with their internet connections, and we'll share all the presentations and resources after the conference with attendees, and we'll send you an email about that. Finally, in terms of housekeeping, I'd like to thank all the speakers who are supporting CARES today. It's really brilliant to have so much contribution from communities, partner organisations, contractors, developers, and also those outside the energy sector who are going to share their experience with us. In terms of who we are, the Scottish Government's Community and Renewable Energy Scheme is delivered by Local Energy Scotland. And Local Energy Scotland is a consortium of energy saving trusts, Changeworks, the Energy Agency and SCARF. And working in this consortium manner means we've got staff based across the country, so we can work effectively with communities across the country. I love what I do. I feel incredibly fortunate that my job is to help local communities do amazing things and make their communities better places to live and help tackle climate challenges as well. And our mission at CARES is to support communities to engage with, participate in and benefit from the energy transition to net zero emissions. And I think it's really important, those words, energy, participate and benefit. As a country, we've made great progress decarbonising our electricity network, but this transition didn't really need us to change the way we live and work. With an increased focus on decarbonisation of buildings, there's a target of 1 million Scottish homes by 2030 using low and zero emission heatings. That's 1 million in the next 8 years. This means we need people to install heat pumps now and not install new gas and oil heating. We need to accelerate progress with heat networks and building these out. This transition will need people to act and communities to be out there having conversations with people, talking about climate change, changing views and trying to make it easier for people to act. This transition needs us to engage and participate in, and it can't just be done to us. And I suppose the final point on this is I often find that communities are the ones leading the way, and sometimes it's the public sector and businesses catching up. So communities have a role. All this transition needs to be done in a just way. And there's going to be other speakers who perhaps talk a little bit more about the national just transition outcomes. But I kind of feel that community energy aligns with many of these. And I would just highlight perhaps citizens, communities and place, which is empowering and invigorating communities and strengthening local economies. And I feel this is intrinsically linked to ownership and participation. Finally, in terms of policies, CARES is very driven by a target of 2 gigawatts of renewable energy in community and local ownership by 2030. We're almost halfway there at the moment, so we've got a lot of work to do over the next 8 years to meet that target. CARES also contributes towards the heat and building strategies and the Climate Change Act as well, and the targets within that. In terms of our priorities, there is quite a big focus at the moment on community buildings, and we're really aware we need to try and make these as sustainable, affordable as possible. They have such an important function within local communities, and also they're going to be a way that individuals within communities can get familiar with low carbon technologies, come and see a heat pump, understand how it works. We are going to have an increasing focus on the decarbonisation of heat, and we're still supporting a lot of wind, hydro, wind and solar projects, particularly through our community electricity generation. I talked a little bit about shared ownership, and this is where a commercial developer develops a project and a community buys a share in that rather than necessarily developing and owning the whole project. They're just a meaningful partner in that project. We also support around community benefits. This is where commercial developers pay a community benefit to the local community. So, for example, if there's a wind farm in an area, the developer might set up a community benefit fund, and there's around 20 million a year being spent on community arising to Scottish communities from community benefit. That's a great opportunity for local communities, and we're keen to try and ensure maximum impact from that. And we have a how-to session around that later this afternoon. On community energy planning, we're doing less in this area, but we have a fantastic toolkit that helps people think about community planning and how they might engage with their local community to understand the steps to take. In terms of how we can help, I think what differentiates Kearns is our team of development officers who are out there hand-holding and working with local communities from their kind of very initial idea right the way through to seeing the project build out, commission and operate. We also have specialist support who can give more detailed technical advice, and our fund administration team who kind of help make sure the bills get paid on time. We have our website that has our Cares toolkit on, lots of case studies which we think are really important to share stories. We have our Facebook group, and we also have guides around getting started on projects. So, you know, lots of information, and as we do anything new, we try and share our learnings. Finally, we have funding as well that we can provide through Cares, and this might be, if you want a feasibility study, we might just give you a technical advisor to complete that work rather than you apply for a grant. We also have themed funding calls, like, for example, our community buildings call or off electricity call, and we have tailored grants and loan packages as well to support you to act. A lot of our focus today is around action, and I want to talk about a few projects to try and illustrate recent achievements and projects and activities that are going on at the moment. The first, and you'll hear more about this in the how-to session, is Crosstakes wind farm, and we think this is a really exciting project. It was developed by Muirhall Energy. They were a local developer, a local Scottish developer, and they allowed the community to buy 5% of the project. So the community now own 5% of the project and will get the revenues from that in the future. The next one is a project by Park Eco Village Trust in Findhorn. And they've developed 8 affordable units, and Cares was used to put some PV panels on these and to provide a mini district heating scheme so that the homes are all heated and the hot water provided through that scheme. We have been doing a lot of work on hydro recently, and it's great to celebrate these successes. Loch Energy Group, after a huge amount of effort, have started generating electricity this month from their 540 kilowatt hydro generator. So a real achievement for them. In Buchanan, just near Loch Lomond, that community launched their project on the 1st of September, a small 100 kilowatt project, but an amazing achievement. And at the other end of the scale in our hydro projects is Morven Community, and this is the UK's largest community-owned hydropower scheme at 1.6 megawatts, and an amazing achievement by the community to develop, build and now operate that scheme. I've talked a little bit about buildings, and I put 6 examples, recent examples here, but I'll just draw out 2. On the right hand side, you can see, hopefully you can just about make out a picture of a panel being lifted onto the roof, but this is Banks of Dee community owned sports club, and last week they installed 100 kilowatt of PV, so just recently happened. And if you think about the rising prices of electricity and the energy demands of a sports club, this will be crucial for its ongoing sustainability. They're waiting on delivery of batteries during this week to finish the project off. Iscon Scotland recently installed air source heat pump and solar PV and energy storage, and that's on top of a lot of work they've done already to try and make their buildings and their farm as sustainable as possible. And just to sort of give you an idea about the sort of activities that these sort of communities do, Iscon cooked and delivered last year 18,000 meals for low-income householders and elderly people in the South Lanarkshire areas. So, you know, these kind of projects help these communities deliver their kind of full potential. In terms of community climate action off the electricity grid, there are a number of Scottish communities who are off the mainland electricity grid, and the communities themselves have community electricity companies that provide that community with 24-hour power to literally keep the lights on in those communities. So a real undertaking, and there's 2 Egg Electric, where we provided some funding towards some PV and batteries, and Neudart Renewables, who recently renovated their hydro project, replacing the pipeline, and now they have an energy security project that can provide energy security for the next 40 years to the 100 or so businesses that are up and running. I hope those examples have been helpful to sort of, and I have really just picked a few of the completed projects, and you'll hear more about some of those in the sessions this afternoon. And to all those that sort of have or are doing or planning to deliver projects, I just say a big thank you from us for progressing community climate action. We'd like to show you now a video around some work that CARES has been doing to decarbonise community buildings. Claire, if you could perhaps play that video for us. This video and other videos are on our YouTube channel, and please feel free to watch and share these. So Claire, if you can start that.
Yep, just one moment, Chris. And can you see that okay, Chris? I'll press play. Thank you.
Thank you. CARES is the Scottish Government's Community and Renewable Energy Scheme, and it's there to help communities to engage and benefit from the transition to net zero. Achieving net zero is going to require action from us all, and communities are going to have a big part to play in our transition to a low carbon future, whether that's installing renewable heating in a community building, developing a heat network to warm our homes, or generating clean electricity with wind, hydro and solar. These are all projects which are happening now.
Well, it's really important that we look at enabling communities to be able to take forward local energy projects that they believe can make a difference to the local community. I've witnessed it close to my own constituency with the deployment of a wind turbine that not only will provide renewable energy, but it also provide an income to the local community for wider social benefit in the area. And CARES can play an important role in helping to support communities doing exactly that type of thing within their area. So if they are looking at the potential for a renewable energy source within their community, get in touch with Local Energy Scotland. They'll be able to give them advice around this, because it can help to add to all of the work we're doing to make sure we meet our net zero targets for 2045.
We have had a solar PV system fitted on the roof of our school nursery, which is behind us, and we were able to do that with the support of CARES and through receiving a CARES loan, amongst other funding that we've had.
We were involved in helping our primary school get solar panels, and we were part of the fundraising and raising awareness.
We were seeing lots of things on TV and reading about it online, and we were really worried about all the stuff that's going on to do with climate change and stuff like that. So we decided to take matters into our own hands, and this was one of the things that we did.
CARES was a fabulous support to us throughout the project. So they helped us with obviously with the funding, but over and above that, they helped us to access the suppliers that we could get the quotes from. So we needed to get 4 quotes out to tender before we went ahead with the work, and they helped us to identify people that we could use. They helped us to liaise with the council that we needed in order to get the project's permission, because obviously the school is owned by the council, even though the solar panels are ultimately owned by us at the trust. They were there for support and guidance at every step of the process, and for any school or community that was looking to do anything similar to what we've done here at Duddingston Primary School, they are invaluable.
So the project is a community garden with outside beds and inside beds, and a social endeavour, which is the propagation endeavour that's in these tunnels behind us. And literally it's taking from the very beginning, it's taking from seeds to produce.
It's the start of something here in Braehead, and what we want to do is use the potential of the energy to develop a social enterprise, to grow fruit and vegetables on a bigger scale than we've been doing for sale. And then not only can we sell them to generate an income which can support other projects, we can give fresh fruit and vegetables to the lunch club in the community. So we can start to do an awful lot more. And what this will do for us is give us 20 years of a sort of comfort blanket where we will get some of the ongoing costs covered, and we'll take one of our biggest outgoing costs, which is the electricity bill, away entirely. So it does an awful lot for us here at Braehead. So what Kearns has done is it's taken us from the beginning to the end of the project and provided advice, support and access to funding all the way through at every step. It's been great.
I'm Abdul Wahid Khan. I'm one of the trustees. We're 6 founding trustees of this mosque, and we bought this building about 7 years ago and then turned into a mosque. And we've been involved with the development, upgrading and management of this mosque, which is the northernmost mosque in Britain at the moment. It had serious upgrading needed. So we insulated the shell with the building with the Celotex insulation panels. We had no technical clue about those things like solar panels and batteries, and we were contacted by this very friendly and approachable worker for Kearns, and she and her colleagues came to the mosque, explained to us about the project, looked into the feasibility, and literally walked us through the project. And also at that time there was a funding grants available from various organizations, and we got this grant for the solar panel from SEC, and later on we had supplemented that with the batteries inside, and our work is carrying on at the moment, and we may look into heat source pumps and other devices to make it a completely carbon neutral status for this mosque.
Loch Ness Hub came about as part of a wider community consultation here in the village and Glen. We were looking at a number of community assets here, and the Loch Ness Hub developed out of what was formerly the Tourist Information Centre here. As a community-owned building, it was hugely important to us that the building was not only sustainable, but met our environmental targets. Now, Kearns allowed us to address that. We obviously were in touch with Local Energy Scotland, and we walked through a number of the opportunities that were available to us. The Kearns funding was an immense help to the project in terms of air source heat pump, the solar panels. We had single glazed units in the building, so we were able to change them to appropriate glazing, and obviously working towards increasing our U value with insulation investment, as well as changing the lighting system over to LED lighting. Moving forward, it will allow the building to be sustainable for the community and the overall aspects of running the building on an economical and environmentally friendly basis. If there are any other community organisations, even in the setup phase, thinking about doing anything like what we've done here at Loch Ness Hub, I would say to them, get in touch with Local Energy Scotland, get in touch with Kearns, talk to them, tell them about what you're planning, but allow yourself a lot of time to work through the projects. But use all the information that's already out there. You do not need to reinvent the wheel on this, and there's people there that want to help you, so use them.
It was once said by Gandhi that if you want to change the world, you should start with yourself. And my view is that to meet our net zero ambitions, we need to ensure that communities and individuals in those communities feel empowered to play their part in helping us to achieve those targets. And that's why it's extremely important through programmes such as CARES that we help to support and enable local communities to play their part in looking at what they can do to support us in meeting our net zero targets. And that's why programmes like CARES have a really important role in helping to enable and empower local communities to play their part in making sure we tackle climate change, and that's why it's a programme that can play an important part in helping to support communities in taking forward their activities on the ground to make a real difference.
If communities aren't sure where to start, our website's a great resource. It's got lots of case studies and examples and things to give you ideas to get started. And use these ideas to start those conversations in your community and talk to your neighbours and your friends about what you might do and what might be right for you. Trying to change your heat and power to a renewable energy source is a great way to make that building more sustainable, but it's more than that. It's also a way of starting that conversation and raising awareness about what you can do. It's a way of people seeing these technologies and seeing how we're going to heat and power our homes in the future. And it's a great way to get those conversations going and think about what next to become a greener community. Thank you. I hope you found that video. Helpful and interesting. I'll just. It is, and it's just great to hear those stories about the kind of activity that we've been undertaking. So, for those of you considering a community energy project, I hope you've been inspired by the film, and I hope you get a lot out of the rest of the day to give you ideas on how to progress, and I hope you'll approach us for support. So at that point, I'll thank you and ask you to enjoy the rest of CARES Conference 2022. I have, and we'll circulate these slides after, just put some links into some useful things around future events and activities we've got going on, and some links to wider support if there's other things you're interested in finding out more about. But at that point, I'd like to stop and pass you over to Kirsty, who is going to introduce our panel of speakers and start that discussion next. So thank you very much, everyone.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for attending this year's CARES conference. As Chris has just said, the session is being recorded, so if you miss any of it, you'll be able to see it again. My name's Kirsty Lewin, and I'm the Partnership Manager at Local Energy Scotland, and I'm really delighted to welcome our three speakers here on the panel this morning, Professor Janette Web, Professor Tahseen Jafry and Sue Kearns, Deputy Director from the Scottish Government. And between them, they're going to give their reflections and insights on the global energy and climate picture, the situation in Scotland, and climate justice and the just transition. And they're also going to draw out what this might mean for community action on energy and climate change, both now and in the future. So each of the panel members will speak for around 8 minutes, and they're going to use some slides. And at the end of those three presentations, I've got a question for the panel to get them started. And during the session, I'll also invite the panel members to pose their own questions to the others. And we're going to, of course, open up the panel to the audience so that you'll be able to ask some questions as well. We're going to use the chat function for this. Now, because there are so many people here, we'd ask you if you could just restrict your chat to questions so that we can find them quite easily. So if you just find the chat function at the top of your screen, you'll be able to type in your question there. And if you can, where possible, ensure that your question is for all of the panel members. And we have the chat being monitored, and I'll be asking Chris to read out a question from you. So do try and participate. And so with that, I'd now like to welcome our first speaker, Professor Janette Web MBE, and she is the Edinburgh University Professorial Fellow in Social Studies of Energy. And among many of her roles, Jan is co-director of the UK Energy Research Centre and UK Research and Innovation Energy Rev co-investigator. And her research concerns comparative European policy and practice for sustainable heat and low energy buildings and integrated local energy systems. So Jan, over to you, and we're going to hopefully manage your slides for you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kirsty. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation and for the challenge of doing the global context for community energy in Scotland in all of 8 minutes. So I won't hang about. I'll move straight on to the next slide. Not sure whether I can control the slides, can I? Oh yes, I can. Great. So what we have at present is, in my eyes at least, virtual meltdown in every sphere you turn to look at. There are, in short, interacting climate, political, economic, energy crises, all with impacts on our life chances everywhere. Some obviously far worse impacts than others. But let me start at the top of that wheel then on the screen with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which really has thrown many people's lives into a degree of chaos, if not really serious loss and damage. That war, of course, and political instability then have driven an energy price crisis, inflation in the price of fossil fuel energy, but because all of our global energy markets are tied effectively to the price of fossil fuel energy, then we see the costs of everything shooting up, producing that cost of living crisis with major increases. A side effect of that, of course, is major, what I would call unearned increases in profits in the oil and gas sector, or unearned rents, if you like, in that sector. So, for example, in the first 6 months of this year, we saw the 5 big oil companies increase their profits by up to around £100 billion. I beg your pardon, $100 billion in the first 6 months of the year. That sum itself is equivalent to the amount that the richer nations promised the poorer countries as a form of adjustment and adaptation to climate change, which was never delivered. So I won't go on about it, but you can probably tell where I stand on that point. So also, we've seen, of course, profits of some of the pre-contract for difference renewable and nuclear generators increase rapidly, though that varies depending on how they sell their electricity. So a lot of unearned profit in the system at the moment that we could be capturing for social benefit. And then, of course, we've seen European and UK policies shift away from concern with net zero and meeting our climate targets towards, let's call it, energy security, towards keeping the lights on, crudely, this winter and keeping the gas flowing in some way. But we also know from the data that global LNG supply is insufficient. We can't simply plug in liquid gas supplies to replace the oil and gas or the gas supply from Russia, which we are now trying to cut off. And indeed, Russia is cutting its supplies of gas to other parts of Europe. So we're faced with that gap between what has been the demand for energy and current supply of gas, including gas, of course, that we burn in power stations to produce electricity, with considerably more political fragmentation and division resulting from that, and questions certainly in Europe about whether we intend to stand together or will turn to self-protection first and foremost. in the context and alongside that, of course, what we're seeing is intensifying climate crisis and disruption around the world. And despite abundant evidence of that climate breakdown, I think it's fair to say that universal commitments to net zero greenhouse gas targets are in question. There is more doubt about them than there has been in the recent past. We're seeing a new dash, if you like, for coal, oil and gas, the reverse of the COP26 climate summit commitments, fossil fuel subsidies doubling even before the current crisis in 2021. And of course, the UK, bringing it back home, the UK Climate Change Committee progress report saying there has really been little effective progress in implementing net zero strategy. It's perhaps worth just a reminder that the main change in that context in our energy composition globally is simply to add renewables to a system that remains dominated by coal, oil and gas. And if you look at that picture there of global primary energy consumption by source, you'll see that really the renewables are literally like the icing on the large and intensive cake of fossil fuel combustion, coal, oil and gas in particular. Growing, yes, but still a small part of overall energy supply. And I think it's very important to remember that there is a critical need to stop burning the stuff. But we are, of course, ultimately highly dependent still on fossil fuels as a major cause of despite them being a major cause of climate breakdown. So what's the future for community renewable energy in that context? Well, I would agree with Chris's introduction very strongly that the contribution is more important than ever in this context. It's a way of engaging people locally in meaningful action, in giving people a project, and we all love a project, something that gives form and focus to our lives outside our immediate personal troubles and concerns. Of course, that can also bolster people's understanding of the climate crisis and its causes and the necessity for rapid change. It's also a way of gaining insight into how current energy markets actually work. Talking to people over the last few months, friends as well as colleagues, you realise just how complex our current energy markets are and how superficial the understanding that most of us have is. And yet we need to understand better to be able to engage with our political leaders and with our communities in order to change the current status quo. And I think community energy has a critical role to play in that. It also, of course, gives people a degree, even if it's small, a degree of self-determination, and that's vital in our complex societies where it's very easy to feel completely irrelevant to the course of events. So just backing that up, every contribution, no matter how small, every contribution to reducing greenhouse gas emissions counts. It's important. What will community groups face? Well, undoubtedly supply chain issues. I'm sure Tahseen will talk about this, but those critical and conflict minerals that depicted in that little picture there, it's critical to find out more and to ask questions, I think, for community energy activists, to ask those questions about what is buried in that supply chain, what are the practices behind some of those conflict minerals that are embedded in our renewable technologies, and of course increasing prices for technology at the same time. Also recognise the potential for people facing considerably reduced capacity, struggling to deal with their own financial and personal troubles. Arguably, what we need to do, though, is to turn that to yet more innovation and enterprise, to turn that, the classic thing about turning a crisis into an opportunity. I think, again, with Chris, critical point to work on reducing the need for energy and developing local provision, because that both reduces people's bills in current climate and our dependence on fossil fuels. We've seen those examples from Community Energy Scotland, retrofitting homes and community buildings, developing local shared spaces for staying warm, perhaps getting food. There's a lot of opportunities for taking community shares in district heating developments. Challenging but worthwhile, I think, very important in the context of current funding for green heat network developments. Solar PV, of course, we've seen examples, increasingly cost effective, particularly if you need that electricity during daylight hours. And then I know it can be difficult, but collaboration is key, regardless of who you are and what sector you work in and how you're working. Collaboration is lacking and needs desperately to be worked up. And then, of course, holding investors to account. But I think it's also, I just wanted to finish on a wider reflection on the contribution of community energy globally to energy transitions globally. I'm just sticking with very much with Europe, which are the examples I'm aware of from my own work. We know in European countries not dissimilar to Scotland that there are very varied community and local energy structures, and that usually depends on municipal government powers and resources. I think it's fair to say that the stronger local energy systems are associated with countries where there is greater devolution of powers down to municipal government level and control over local resources and budgets. That leads in, of course, to different kinds of energy markets and infrastructures. We know there are examples of Danish community co-ops alongside municipal energy and commercial enterprises. I've had the good fortune to study some of the German community-led initiatives and referenda where they have taken a very direct stand on municipal buyback of regional energy grids, which really isn't an option open to us in Britain. Democratising energy systems wholesale at that local and regional level and redefining energy primarily as a public good rather than as the commercial commodity which it is constructed as in Britain, where initiatives, I think, in community energy are typically small scale. They coexist alongside, I'm part of one of them in Edinburgh, coexists alongside centralised regulation and large scale commercial enterprises in our liberalised market. Now, having said that, of course, that market is changing rapidly at present, huge uncertainties about its future. There is an opportunity there, albeit it might be a small one, but nevertheless there is that Ofgem review at present on the rules for local energy systems and flexibility, and that will be important. I think there's a very significant role there for community energy enterprises to push those questions back to Ofgem and to all of our political representatives about the benefits from integrated local energy systems for all of us across the piece. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan, and apologies for the issues that we're having with the slides. If we can't get them to move along automatically, you can do that yourselves on the screen, and we'll put some information into the chat about that. So if you also, as a presenter, if we're operating the slides for you, if you could say next slide, and then everyone will know to move along to the next slide. So apologies for that again, but they will be made available. So we're now going to move to Professor Tahseen Jafry. She's the director of the Mary Robinson Centre for Climate Justice in Glasgow Caledonian University. And Tahseen's research interests include the justice and equity aspects of climate change, gender and poverty targeting, the management of natural resources, and the geopolitical nature of climate justice. And Tahseen is a qualified engineer and a social scientist. So over to you, Tahseen.
Thank you, Kirsty, and a very good morning, and thank you to all of the organising committee behind today's CARE conference on community climate action. Indeed, this conference, I would say, could not be more timely than it is right now, with the cost of living crisis on our doorstep, of which the cost of energy is a significant part of. I would like to say, and I would like to focus my intervention this morning around a climate justice lens to community energy needs and connecting global to local action. So what can we learn from a global perspective, and how can we use that learning and insight and apply that to the current energy crisis, and indeed in the development of solutions that are not only locally led but are just and fair, ensuring that we leave no one behind, as in the mantra of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I quickly turn my attention to Africa. And so what is it that a continent like Africa is facing in terms of its energy crisis? Well, around 40% of the population on that continent do not have access to energy. In 2019, that figure equates to about 770 million people. Although the percentages vary depending on which country you are from and what your situation is. The challenge the continent is up against is finding ways to achieve access to energy, access in the cheapest form and the way possible, which may vary, which may indeed mean not being reliant on grid, but rather off-grid generation and from renewable sources, including solar power. So to power up and light up Africa requires not only financial support, it requires the right policies and as much political willpower as possible. At the end of the day, this is all about ensuring long-term and sustainable access to energy and stamping out energy poverty. And I know that there are many initiatives across Africa, such as the Sustainable Energy for All, the Light Up and Power Africa by the African Development Bank, and Lighting Africa by the World Bank Group. But I want to share a few insights from our work funded by the Scottish Government called Light Up Malawi. And I would just want to share, if I may, my screen. If you just bear with me a second, and I'll put the PowerPoint up there. Okay, hopefully you can see that on your screen just now. Can I just check, Kirsty? Can you all see that?
We can see it, yeah, but we can see the whole presentation, not just the main slide you're working in.
Okay, can you see that now?
Yeah.
Okay, so our work with the Scottish Government was looking at the impact of solar lights and to address a key question on what can be done to increase the scale of adoption and benefits to all. And we worked with Mzuzu University's Department of Energy Studies to do this work, and you can see on the map there, circled in red, the locations we were operating in: North, Central and South Malawi. So we understand quite clearly the impact that lights are making life better for men, women, children, for children going to school, and from a climate justice perspective, it promotes the need to move away from paraffin and candles. It makes the environment cleaner and healthier, and women can go out at night carrying the lights with them and feeling safe and secure. And there's a whole list of benefits there, but I don't really have time to go into all of it. But what we really wanted to focus in on: what is happening to those at the bottom end and those who are the poorest and the most vulnerable, who don't have access to even the cheapest solar lights? And what we found is that the cost of the cheapest lights, equivalent of £4.80, was way beyond the reach of those in the villages that we were working in. They could only, the income of people who have only £1.20 per month. So they were telling us the solar lights are only for rich people and not for people like us here in villages. And that told us a very stark story, a very real story, that even though the idea of having solar lights is really practical and sensible, without really doing our homework and understanding what community needs are, we find that even those lights were out of reach of those who need it the most. To summarise this and to cut a long story short, what this bottles down to is finding ways in which to get access to lights for everyone, ensuring we leave no one behind, developing partnerships, working in close collaboration with communities, and radically shaking up those approaches to ensure that we reach those at the bottom end of the economic pyramid. And it comes down to a number of things. It's about looking at access to, it's about affordability, this is about availability, and this is about awareness of all the different options that are available to those out there. And from a climate justice lens, what I would like to say, it comes down to 3 simple climate just values. It's about inclusivity, this is about voice, and this is about ensuring participation. If I just stop sharing my screen now, I'll come back to you in a second. Okay, so I've stopped sharing now. This is about ensuring that our policies are designed and developed and implemented in such a way that they actually tackle the problems that are being experienced right now by communities on the front line of the energy crisis, particularly those in rural and remote. So there's a lot of learning that we can share from our work from a global context. The second part of my intervention, and I'll just move on to this very, very quickly, is on the issue of just transition. We in Scotland, I would say, are privileged to some extent that for those who can afford to do so, can have access to green energy, electric vehicles, and we are investing heavily in wind, wave and solar to clean up and move away from fossil fuels. However, and if I could bring again a global lens to this too, our journey to our transition will rely heavily on the extraction and mining of minerals and metals to fuel our process. And of the many minerals required, many come from sub-Saharan Africa. The extraction of these will come at an environmental and social cost, most of which will be borne by those countries that are already facing many climate and environmental disasters. And according to the World Bank, it is estimated that over 3 billion tonnes of minerals and metals will be needed for wind, solar and geothermal power for achieving a below 2-degree future. Minerals such as graphite, lithium and cobalt may increase in demand by nearly 500% by 2050. So in short, our transition to clean energy in Scotland must, I would say, take into account of the potential impacts globally, but in terms of solutions, working in partnerships with industry, government and civil society, and to incorporate climate just values and principles, ensuring that we in Scotland ensure that our transition is done correctly and sustainably. So we as consumers have full transparency, and in the supply chain and working with the resource-rich developing countries, ensuring that they are not impacted negatively, but rather protected. So I hope those thoughts contribute to the rest of the discussion at this plenary, and thank you. Back to you, Kirsty.
Thank you so much, Tahseen, and yeah, very powerful call on sustainability and inclusion there. I'm just going to introduce Sue, but in order to clear some space on the screen for the PowerPoint, Jan and Tahseen, if you wouldn't mind just switching your cameras off while Sue does her presentation. And again, if there's an issue with the PowerPoint, Sue, if you could just say next slide as we go along, and people can manage that, and hopefully we'll get it sorted out. So yeah, so Jan and Tahseen, if you just switch your cameras off just now. So Sue Kearns is the Deputy Director of Heat and Buildings for the Scottish Government, and she is well known to many of us for her long connection and dedicated support for CARES. Sue has worked in energy policy roles since around 2006, and she's driven development of policy and support on community and local energy, where Scotland is now recognised as leading within the UK. And Sue covers key areas of policy under Scotland's energy transition, notably heat and buildings. It's over to you, Sue.
Thank you very much, Chris. Brilliant. Very much for having me today. I have to say that I'm kind of disappointed not to be here in person, if you like. Sorry not to see everyone. Really enjoy CARES conferences, and it can be very inspiring, even if you get heckled, but really, really good to see people. Thanks also to Chris. I think that was a really inspiring talk earlier on. It was great to see some of those things on the video, and also sort of being here, sort of sandwiched between Jan and Tahseen, and also then the minister later. I'm kind of left with, what do I add to this? So I think Jan has already sort of covered a lot of the global issues and the crisis. Tahseen's also done her bit around sort of the African connection. And I think as an example, I think I'd like to go with kind of applied policy for the Scottish Government policy this morning. I hope that will be of interest to you. So if you go to the next slide, please, Kirsty. I can't see the next slide. I don't know if it's on the screen.
So what we need people to do is just press the arrow along. So you should be able,
Okay, so really I'm telling everyone to go to the next slide.
Yeah, you are. Yeah, thanks,
okay.
Sue.
Oh, that's fine. Okay, so I'd like to talk to you today is mainly around the heat buildings connection for CARES, really, because the heat in buildings policy that we need to do is really important within the whole net zero challenge, as already has been alluded to by Chris when he mentioned the 1 million homes that need to be decarbonised to renewable heating by 2030. That is what the 75% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions 2030 target means. That's a huge step up from where we are at the moment when we're looking at 3,000 renewable installations going into homes at the moment per year. And we've really got to get it up to probably around 200,000 a year towards the end of this decade. That's a huge step up. At the same time, we've got to try to make sure that fuel poverty does not increase, and we need to get it down to no more than 5% by 2040. I think we've already mentioned that the energy price crisis at the moment. We think that as a result of the UK government's intervention, the energy price guarantee that was announced a couple of weeks ago for domestic householders, that in Scotland will still result in about 35% of households being in fuel poverty, and possibly a quarter of households being in extreme fuel poverty. That's with the UK government's intervention. So, these are really, really challenging times, and we need to see what we can do about that. So if you can go to the next slide, please. When you look at sort of the community aspect to this, I think that communities need to get involved in that domestic challenge. But, as we stand at the moment, there is the whole kind of non-domestic challenge where you have 50,000 non-domestic buildings need to be decarbonised by 2030 as part of that overall target. We need to think about what CARES and community and local energy policy can do as part of that. We know that the heat transition will look very different in different communities. We have a local energy policy statement which outlines the need for greater focus on decarbonisation as the driver for community-led action. And CARES as a support scheme is doing its bit as part of that very practically on the ground. Next slide. So CARES itself, we have been sort of working over the years. Obviously, CARES started in 2010, so over a decade ago, very much looking at electricity. And Chris has already sort of mentioned some of the hydro schemes that are still happening in Scotland, which is brilliant to hear that these are still happening. But I mean, in terms of numbers and the difference that makes, this is fine and really good to see. But I think we need to think about sort of beyond that. What we need to do is sort of spread across Scotland in terms of decarbonisation of heat. We need to pull the community energy that we have in community energy, if you see what I mean. We need to pull those community energy groups in to the decarbonisation of heat challenge. So we've already started to do that, to bring CARES closer to heat and buildings strategy. And that was with the Let's Do Net Zero Community Buildings funding call, which Chris mentioned, which closed, I think, September last year, which awarded over 2.6 million in funding to, I think it's over 70 projects. That's a really good start, and I think we're now sort of having that call open on a rolling basis. And as the slide says, there are some really good projects starting to come through. Next slide. This fits within sort of a wider review of energy policy in Scotland. We are to publish within the next few months an energy strategy and just transition fund. And again, we need to see how we can make sure that community and local energy fit within that wider Scottish Government strategy and is given a very sort of strong place within that wider strategy. And I think Jan made a very good point at the way that community projects are often seen as on the edge of sort of the wider commercial scheme. They're not sort of subverting that wider commercial way of doing business in Scotland. So we need to try to exploit the situation that's there. And I know that, Mr. Harvie, he's speaking later, and obviously there is a political angle to that, which is for him and not for me to say, but there might be other views of what more communities could do in an independent Scotland, a community energy. So there is something to think about there. But the whole, Chris is right, I think, sort of community energy fits really well within Just Transition, and we've run some engagement events to look at that and to think about what more we can do within the current context. Shared ownership, I think, is a really important part of community energy. We've been working on community energy through CARES, as I say, for over a decade, and a lot of that has been through community-owned, sort of directly owned schemes. But more and more, we've been thinking about the benefits of shared ownership in commercial schemes. If we do have commercial schemes already sort of in development, then let's see if we can think about communities getting a stake in that. And Chris's video highlighted one of those. I would like to see a lot more of those. I think we had a target for by 2020 for communities to basically have a share or be offered a stake in at least half of all commercially developed schemes. I'm told that in a technical sense, we met that target, but I think in terms of take up, I think we've got a lot further to go and take up of offers coming along. I'd really like to see those community stakes being offered just as in a routine manner by developers when they're developing projects, so that communities can get the benefit of locally sourced energy. So I think Scotland has a legacy of strong community engagement in local renewable energy projects. And I think community energy is uniquely placed to help unlock and seize those opportunities. We need to put more focus on decarbonisation for community-led action, and I think decarbonisation of buildings, so both non-domestic, so community-owned buildings, as we already offer support for. And I think the Minister will be telling you about sort of the next stage of how we hope to get communities involved in helping on domestic decarbonisation through looking at communal heating. I think that's really important to go further. So that's all I need to say today. So I think that was a big sort of run through, I think, the link with Scottish Government policy, but really looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue and Jan and Tahseen. If you pop your cameras back on, and Sue, so that we can see you all. So I'm going to just ask a question to get started, and I hope we'll see some questions coming through the chat function. So as many of you will be aware, COP27, the Global UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is meeting in Cairo in November. And many of us will be looking at what other countries are doing as well as our own. Now, you've touched on this in your presentations, Jan and Tahseen, but I'd like to explore further in terms of what core lessons might we learn from some other countries about community action on energy. And Sue, what do you think other countries might take from us? So Tahseen, if you would like to answer that first, and we'll keep it fairly brief if we can, because we've only got another 20 minutes or so, and I'd like to get quite a few questions in.
Thanks, Kirsty, for that. COP27 will be in Sharm in a few weeks' time, and the issue of just transition will be front and centre of that. I think from a global perspective, in terms of community action on energy, because the countries that we're talking about in places such as sub-Saharan Africa, they're grappling with poverty and development at the same time. So they need to transition everyone so that everyone has access to energy, like I mentioned. And so there's a lot of push and energy behind getting communities involved as much as they can. But the critical issue lies around funding and resourcing to support that community action to even take place, because a lot of the funding that has been there thus far has been diverted away to tackle other climate emergencies and disasters that these countries are experiencing, which are unprecedented, from floods and drought. So the resources are just not there, and so it's limiting what communities are actually able to do and deliver just now.
Thanks, Tahseen. That's a really important point, isn't it, that we mustn't lose sight of, particularly the events that have been happening in Pakistan and the Philippines, etc. Jan, so you had mentioned, a couple of examples, but just wondered what, obviously energy systems are different in every country, but is there anything that we could take from some of those examples that would, support the transition here in Scotland and perhaps speed up the transition at community level?
Yeah, it's quite hard to answer that in shorthand, because those countries that I've studied, for example, in Northern Europe, also have very different, despite the fact we're notionally in a single electricity market, certainly. And of course, we're in European gas markets as well, part of our current troubles. When you look at the institutional structures in those energy markets, they differ considerably, and it does, as I tried to say, it does depend. The scope for communities to show leadership really depends on the institutions in place and the interface between local government powers or municipal government powers and communities. And I've heard a lot of use of the word citizen in European research, and a lot of the use of the word consumer in research in Britain. And, I think we are at risk of forefronting that identity of the consumer. Now, yeah, we all consume to live, but the institution of the consumer has been built systematically through the market measures that we've had in place for 40 years now in Britain. That idea of the consumer as the be-all and end-all of life is not at the same position in other European countries. And I think if we can learn anything, we can learn to talk more about citizenship and the mutual responsibilities of citizens, particularly in relatively affluent countries, to challenge our political leaders and those internationally to show much better, much stronger and sincere commitment, and to act with integrity on climate crisis. I'll shut up there.
Thanks, Jan. That's a really important point, and I think we often see that word citizen used in many other sectors as well in Europe, where we tend not to hear. Sue, so just in terms of picking up those points, I think we do see a lot of citizen action around CARES. In fact, it's what it's about, really. What lessons do you think could be passed on from the CARES approach or community energy approach at COP27 in terms of community action? What do we do well here?
I think the value of direct support. I certainly know it's a very long time ago now, but we did have an OECD study on community energy in Scotland, and basically picked out Scotland as being sort of one of the leaders on that. And it's through the direct support which actually gives communities the help that they need to then think about other things. So I know that's always something that the Scottish Government's been very keen to sort of make sure that we have that CARES funding in place, and it's supported across Parliament actually. So it's very well sort of recognised as important. But I think the second thing is, if you were looking at COP27 at any other sort of countries in the same position as us, maybe, you know, sort of subnational, sort of if you're looking at sort of in other contexts, you know, it might be sort of regional economies where there might not be direct powers over the energy system. I'd say what you could learn from what we do in Scotland is what you can do without powers for the energy system, because we don't have any. So we've managed to sort of promote community benefits and community shares in commercial generation without any powers over commercial developers, and I think we've made a huge difference across the UK because of the example that we've set here through leadership on the public estate, through pushing the 5 megawatts, basically through pushing the community target. I think that, you know, we've made a huge difference to what communities have been able to achieve.
Thanks, Sue. Tahseen, I see you've got your hand up. Did you want to come back in? Yep.
Yes, if I could, I was just bouncing off what Jan was saying in terms of the consumer, and it's just so great to hear about the role of citizens and the role of the consumer. And I think listening to what Sue is saying, we're in a very strong position to show good leadership here, because we are basing a lot of our work on climate justice, and we're committed to that. And I think if we put power in the hands of the consumer in our transition to net zero, then we in a way are trying to build in accountability and transparency and clarity in our transition to a green, clean and a safer environment. And it's so vitally important that we do that, so that we do not impact negatively the countries who are going to be on the front of bearing the costs of the transition as we progress.
Thanks, Tahseen. So we'll now take a question from the floor. So I'm hoping that Chris is going to provide me with one.
Yeah, we've got loads of really good questions actually, but I'll pick one which got 4 thumbs up. So we'll start with that one. While communities increasingly want to generate their own energy, the current economic situation is making the cost of building projects very uncertain. This makes projects much harder to plan. How should communities deal with these uncertainties?
So I think we'll start with Sue there. Yeah.
I think, well, the obvious thing is speak to CARES really for the technical advice. Make sure that you've got a really good project manager. That's always been very key to actually doing your direct generation projects. Be realistic. I mean, CARES is there so that for the electricity, the direct generation projects, to take away that risk for communities. That was the point of having it set up in a way that, you know, that sums could be written off if projects didn't get through planning. And obviously they have to have their best shot at getting through planning and so on. But I think that basically you need as much technical advice as you can get, and that's what the support that we offer is there to do. So I'm sorry if that sounds very kind of Scottish Government policy line, but you know, it really is the point of the programme.
Thanks very much, Sue. Jan, turning to you, what would you recommend to communities thinking about this at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a particularly challenging time, obviously, and adds to significantly to the uncertainty that community energy initiatives in Britain often face over how you pull all the funding together, how you sustain that kind of collaboration and alliance. I think the current crisis means that it's even more significant up front to do the homework on what funding and support is available. And of course, in Scotland, CARES and Local Energy Scotland is the doorway, the way into that. But also critically, to look to people. We've done a little bit of research on green bonds, on mutuals, on self-financing elements of community energy initiatives, and just looking at some of the social surveys, there is a willingness apparently of people broadly where they do have some disposable income under their control, those that do still, to contribute to those kinds of municipal bonds and to build up the assets locally, to contribute to local projects. I mean, again, there are various initiatives around the area where I live in Edinburgh, which, we're realising, OK, we're relatively affluent. We can still put some money in. We're realising that there is a benefit of all of us contributing to create a fund on which we can draw to support that work. And then, of course, it's critical to build on that through whatever grants and indeed low-cost loans are available. But yeah, it requires stamina and determination. On the other hand, it's good to have that kind of purpose and motivation.
Thanks, Jan. And Tahseen?
If I could just jump in very, very quickly, and it's a great question, and I think if I can reflect on just our experiences of working and dealing with these issues globally, it's what I found it's really helpful, aside from budgeting and planning and building and troubleshooting, is how communities get strength and energy from each other by supporting each other. And I think that's vitally important, is finding ways to build resilience amongst each other and amongst ourselves in a time of crisis. And I say that because we've just finished a project in Malawi looking at the mental health and well-being of communities on the front line of the climate crisis. And what we found through our work there is the fact that there is no support to support those rural and remote communities, but how women are particularly finding strength amongst themselves to support each other and learning from each other until such times where they are able to get financial and other resources and support. And I hope that's helpful in some way, but I'm just reflecting on some of the work that we've just finished ourselves.
Thank you, Tahseen. Yeah, really, it's a really important point when we think about the complexities faced here in terms of what communities may be facing who have no access to energy at all in their areas. So Chris, I see lots of questions flashing up on the chat. We've probably got time for maybe one or two more, so we'll take the next one, please.
We've got a question about hydrogen. I've not heard much about the role of green hydrogen in decarbonising the natural gas system. Larger scale trials are already taking place, and for many Scottish homes, retrofitting with heat pumps is very expensive and an inefficient option. All new houses should have heat pumps. So I think the question's around the role of green hydrogen in decarbonising existing homes.
So I'll put that question to Jan first.
I think, yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? This is as far as I'm aware, and Sue no doubt can update us on this, this is a moving area in Scottish Government policy at the moment. There's considerable debate about what the prospects for green hydrogen actually look like and what critically what the price tag for that would be. Now, on the one hand, we know that there is potentially opportunity in Scotland from curtailed onshore wind power, for example, to capture that, to use electrolysis to create green hydrogen. And to use that for local purposes. But the current evidence on the academic side, at least, suggests that really the best uses of that hydrogen, because it will still be quite a high price, will be for local industrial use. So it doesn't have to be transported very far, because the cost of infrastructure to transport hydrogen safely is considerable in itself. And also, of course, heavy goods movement, freight, potentially rail. We've got a few examples of public transport vehicles in Aberdeen, hydrogen powered buses. But there's a long way to go to say that that could be a source of gas for heating our homes. Indeed, we know in terms of the chemistry of hydrogen, it's an extremely small molecule, so it leaks into the atmosphere. The global warming potential is not negligible, albeit it's shorter term than CO2. But still, there are lots of issues there. I think UK government's intention is to make a decision in 2026. I think that's the right date on the prospects for a hydrogen-based gas infrastructure. And of course, these are powers that sit with the UK government, with the Westminster Parliament strictly, and not with Scotland. So a lot of questions, more questions than answers, I would say, over the prospects for green hydrogen. Not an immediate resolution for heating in homes, that's for sure. And we will see, no doubt downstream, how that pans out.
Thanks, Jan. Sue, would you like to add or have a different opinion to that?
No, I sort of building on that, I totally agree with what Jan has said. I think for us in Scotland, it comes down to timing. There is a lot of uncertainty around the prospects for green hydrogen. And I think when you look at what we need to do in terms of decarbonising the heating in our homes and other buildings by 2030, and you look at the UK government saying that it is not going to come to a decision or start to look at a decision till 2026 for hydrogen, we can't afford to wait. We can't afford to wait for that. We have to look at decarbonising our homes now, and the solutions that are available now with electrical heating are largely through heat pumps. There are other forms of zero emission heating as well, but that's what we need to start doing. We can't afford to wait if we are to meet our 2030 target. The Scottish Government does support hydrogen. We'd like to see that grow in Scotland, and I think Jan is absolutely right, where the potential is mainly on the industrial use side and also for transport. We don't at the moment see a large use for hydrogen in heating, so pre-2030, but it is something that obviously we're looking at really closely. But I think there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment as to the timing on the sort of the costs coming down for green hydrogen overall. We have to get going on hydrogen.
Thanks, Sue. Tahseen, would you like to add anything to that?
No, Kirsty, I'm not an expert in green hydrogen, but all I do want to say is that it's still an evolving and developing technology, and I think the cost implications are considerable from what I understand. So that really needs to be borne into the mix in terms of implementation and wide-scale adoption and use.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we can probably squeeze in another question, possibly even two, Chris.
Okay, well, I'll give you them one at a time, or I can give you two. The first will be, what do the panel think of the idea of contributions to the global climate justice funds from energy developers in Scotland? For example, as well as local community benefit funds, also a contribution to global climate justice and equity fund being included as part of the Scottish Government's good practice principles, linking global and local responsibility of Scotland's journey to a net zero transition. Did you get the gist of that?
I think we'll just take that one because it's quite a long one, and we'll see how we get on. Tahseen, we'll start with you.
Well, I mean, I think well, the Scottish Government have been kind of like leaders in this area for some time now, in the idea of the Global Climate Justice Fund. In fact, there is a fund being rolled out just now to look at how to achieve justice for those who are on the front line of the climate crisis in Africa. And I think although much of the onus is placed in those countries, I think it would be really interesting to have or be able to reciprocate some initiatives or some ideas that link transition and justice to our journey to net zero. I think connecting global and local is really, really important. There's a gap in conversation around this area just now. It's much needed, and my fear is that that the Scottish Government have, that we have championed climate justice, and we're leaders in this, no doubt. But my fear is that as we transition to net zero, then we might be embarking on a second wave of injustices being placed on those who are on the front line of the climate crisis. And I would hope that we would be able to spearhead discussion and conversation to show how we are tackling those very difficult and challenging agendas.
Thank you, Tahseen. Sue, do you want to respond?
Is the expert around those sort of wider global social justice and climate justice issues. I think just to pick up on just the community benefits of best practice side of the just transition, we certainly have within the guidance that we already have as Scottish Government, we do have the option that communities could look at putting aside funding for climate justice sort of more generally, so that with their own communities. So that's seen there as something that they should be, it's pointed at as something that they should do. But again, I don't think it's for us as Scottish Government to dictate to communities on how they use the funding that they have, either from income, from their own schemes, or as community benefit. But it's certainly something that's pointed to as could be good practice.
Thank you. And finally to Jan, and this will be the last question. So Jan, you have a minute or so to answer that question, please.
Right, thank you. So I think for one thing, I would say, yes, it's about socially responsible investing at Scottish level, from top to bottom of Scottish society, both from government and communities and individuals in that sense. And of course, we have some complex supply chains where the actual operations in those supply chains are opaque. It's very hard to know. If I use my phone, I really, I'm a sub-expert in using a very complex little machine. I haven't yet, I'm even less expert in what's gone into the composition of that mobile phone or this computer that I'm using, where those resources came from, what the costs were, as I'm pretty sure there were costs to the people where those minerals originated from and resources are exploited, as we know. We need to be a lot cleverer in Scotland and in the affluent countries of the world at recovering and reusing the minerals that are already being thrown away in our electronic waste heaps, and creating further pollution and health problems all around the world. So yes, that's kind of international responsibility. We should be leading on that, and I would love to see community energy groups being part and parcel of that movement for socially responsible investing.
Thank you so much, and that brings the panel session to a close. And I think we've had a really stimulating and thought-provoking conversation that's given us in Local Energy Scotland a lot to think about, to go away after the conference and absorb this. So normally if we were at a live event, we would all clap. So if you could just give a virtual clap to Jan, Tahseen and Sue, and to say thank you so much for the conversation. And I'm now going to hand over to Chris, who's going to take the session forward with the Minister. And Jan, Tahseen and Sue, if you could switch yourselves off. And thank you again.
Hi everybody, thank you very much for that. It was a really interesting discussion. And I'd just highlight that we have got quite a lot more questions. We'll have a go at answering some of these and perhaps get a bit of input from the panel where required, but quite a lot are kind of signposting to different things. So we'll certainly try that. So for our keynote speech, I'm really delighted that we've got Mr. Harvie here, who's the Minister for Zero Carbon Buildings, Active Travel and Tenants Rights. And I can see him there, and hopefully we'll just get his camera on as well soon. It is a busy portfolio he's got, and you know the discussion we've had this morning has had a real focus on heating buildings and the decarbonisation of that. So it'll be really good to hear from Mr. Harvie on that. Following the address, we have got time for questions, and Patrick Harvie's agreed to stay on, and we'll open up the floor again. So please start thinking of your questions, and we'll populate them. I've got a couple that were submitted in advance, and I'll ask them first, and then I'll open up to the floor. But without further ado, it'd be really great to hear from Mr. Harvie, and I'd invite you to make your keynote address. There you are. Welcome.
Many thanks. Really good to see you. I'm delighted to have been invited to speak at the Community Renewable Energy Scheme conference. And I know there's a really big audience out there watching online. I know it doesn't always feel that way when you're just looking at a screen instead of us all being together in a room. But this is a really big event, and I'm really pleased to see that there's such a strong level of interest from across the community and local energy sector. As all of you know, the climate emergency is here with us now, and we need to end Scotland's contribution to climate change urgently. But we have to do that in a way that's just and fair, with communities at the heart. Local and community energy projects have got a huge role to play in that challenge. They've got the potential to transform communities, helping to reduce emissions, create local jobs, increase the skill base in a local community, reduce energy costs, and bring greater investment to local economies, and do it in a way also that brings people together to discover their own collective power. Community energy has made really important progress over the last decade, but we know that it has the potential to do much more as part of our transition to net zero. To realise that potential, we have to go further and target support in a way that delivers more localised energy solutions, solutions that are supported by local communities and that can bring a benefit to everyone. Before I say a bit more about the actions that we're taking to support communities to turn these opportunities into a reality, I want to say something about the wider context, because as well as the climate and ecological emergency that we're facing, we're also in the middle of an unprecedented economic and cost crisis, which is putting enormous financial pressure as well as huge anxiety onto people in terms of their home life, their communities and businesses across Scotland. So while the long overdue measures that were announced recently by the UK government will limit some of the more severe impacts, the average £2,500 that domestic consumers will be expected to pay is still unsustainable for far too many people. So we are still pressing for extra support for vulnerable consumers. And while last week's latest announcement may limit the impact of the energy price crisis on some businesses, this announcement has come too late for many across Scotland who are already struggling with their bills. Capping wholesale business energy bills is expensive, but the way it's being done appears to be an inadequate measure that doesn't target support to those who need it most. And clarity on the protection following the 31st of March next year is going to be required as soon as possible to make sure that businesses have the certainty and security they need to operate with confidence. But while the UK government does need to do much more, we are also taking direct action of our own here in Scotland. This month's programme for government sets out the measures that we're taking to support households, businesses and public services in response to the cost crisis. The immediate actions we're taking this year include a freeze on rent and on rail fares and a moratorium on evictions. We've also increased the Scottish Child Payment and doubled our Fuel Insecurity Fund. And of course, a key part of the longer term solution to this crisis is our journey to net zero. Energy bills have been rising because of the cost of gas, which makes it all the more vital that we continue to move away from fossil fuels and toward energy efficient zero carbon buildings. This underlines the importance of our heat in buildings strategy, which aims to make our buildings cleaner, greener and easier to heat while removing poor energy performance as a driver of fuel poverty. We've committed to investing at least £1.8 billion of public money over the course of this session of Parliament to deliver on these outcomes. We'll need to cut emissions in a way that's consistent with our statutory fuel poverty targets, prioritising support for those who are least able to pay. We have a range of well-established programmes that many of you will be familiar with to help us do this, from Warm Home Scotland, Business Energy Scotland, and of course the area-based schemes that are run with local authorities. These schemes provide advice and financial support to householders and businesses looking to install zero-emission heating systems or to make their buildings more energy efficient and affordable to heat. We've taken steps recently to expand our Home and Business Energy Scotland advice programmes to help those people who are struggling with spiralling energy costs. And those measures form part of a £1.2 million package of support which we announced last month, and which includes additional funds for consumer-facing advice services. Now, in outlining some of the response to this wider context in our existing delivery programmes and sources of support, I want to make the link now to Kearns itself, our community and renewable energy scheme, the reason that we're here today. Like our other programmes, Kearns has a key role to play in supporting our just transition to net zero, while helping to address broader issues relating to fuel poverty and the cost of living crisis. Chris and his team at Local Energy Scotland, who deliver Kearns on behalf of the Scottish Government, provide support to communities looking to develop renewable energy, heat decarbonisation and energy efficiency projects. The current Kearns contract continues to support communities looking to explore and develop renewable energy projects, but it also has a stronger focus on heat decarbonisation, in keeping with our heat and building strategy and goals. Kearns is committed to reaching communities right across Scotland, including those groups that may have been underrepresented in the past. It's there to help them engage with and participate in and benefit from the transition to net zero. And as I think Sue was highlighting earlier in her presentation, the Let's Do Net Zero Community Buildings Fund is already seeing a wide range of really interesting projects from across Scotland, helping communities reduce their building energy costs and greenhouse gas emissions by installing renewable technologies such as heat pumps. This allows these communities the community organisations to continue to provide essential support and local services and make a real difference within their communities. We're also putting a strong focus on our remote and rural communities. Kearns is providing a tailored package of support to a group of remote and rural off-grid communities. This will help them to upgrade their energy systems, reduce carbon and become more resilient and sustainable. And I know that there'll be people here today who have already received support from Kearns and who've invested a huge amount of your time and effort in individual projects. I want to thank each and every one of you and the Local Energy Scotland team for your hard work and dedication in developing your ideas and bringing projects to life. Now, as I said at the start, we have to go further and continue to evolve and build on the support that we provide so that we can enable communities to realise the opportunities presented by the just transition to net zero. And with this in mind, I'm really delighted to take this opportunity to mention that we plan to launch a new community heat development programme later this year. The programme is being developed by the Scottish Government and Local Energy Scotland in line with a stronger focus across Kearns on heat decarbonisation. And subject to funding, the programme will run till the end of the current Kearns contract in March 2025, and it will aim to support eligible community organisations and groups of householders to come forward with locally generated heat project concepts. Local Energy Scotland will assess applications in line with the eligibility criteria, and the successful applicants will receive technical support to appraise the feasibility and develop a business case. And where a project is assessed as feasible, it can then look to apply for capital funding via routes such as the Scottish Government's Heat Network Fund. so that they can progress the project. I'm confident that this programme will play an important role in helping local communities come together, work collectively to find ways to decarbonise their heat. Importantly, it will help develop community learning and models for community heat, which then have the potential to be replicated in other communities across Scotland. There'll be further information about the programme available on the Local Energy Scotland website soon. For communities and groups of householders interested in working together on this project, I'd really encourage you to speak to the team at Local Energy Scotland to register your interest. It's obviously appropriate that we're announcing this new programme during Scotland's Climate Week. For those who might not be aware, this is our flagship week to celebrate and showcase the work that's already happening on climate change, but to encourage further action, very much in keeping with the goals of this conference. The motto for this year's Climate Week is Let's Talk Climate, and it aims to engage businesses, organisations and communities in Scotland's response to the global climate emergency, celebrating our collective actions, but also encouraging all of us toward greater efforts to help achieve net zero. This Climate Week, we're asking everyone to get involved with hosting conversations on climate change with colleagues, families and communities up and down the country. It's a simple and free approach, and there's a digital conversations pack available online for people who want to get involved. Since the theme of this year's CARES conference is community climate action, I want to end by mentioning the Scottish Government's regional climate action hubs and climate action towns. Knowledge sharing and capacity building through nationwide networks are a great way to ensure the continued growth of community action and community energy. We know the critical role that communities will play in driving forward climate action. That's why it's so important to empower people to take action in their own communities and in their own lives. That's why the Scottish Government is supporting the development of a network of regional community climate action hubs. This network provides a vehicle for communities to work together to engage in collective climate action and to explore and adopt low carbon behaviours that fit well with their area's needs and aspirations. I started today by stating that the climate emergency is, of course, already here. We're living in it, and that community and local energy has a vital role to play in addressing it. We need to make sure that the transition is a just one for every community across Scotland, and that we build resilience into these communities as we transition, especially in light of the current context of the cost and energy crisis. Communities in Scotland have led the way in their engagement with community and local energy projects, but as our energy system evolves, we must ensure that this continues, and that our policies and delivery programmes go further and help accelerate the shift toward more localised energy solutions. CARES continues to adapt and respond to these wider challenges, supporting Scottish communities to grasp the opportunities that are presented by our rapidly evolving energy system and our just transition to net zero. So I hope you enjoy today's sessions, the how-to sessions this afternoon, and the rest of the discussions. I really look forward to seeing more of your successful projects become a reality right up and down the country. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. That was really excellent and really good to hear, obviously, about the sort of further work on heat and you know, your interest in sort of CARES projects, which we'll make sure we share. I've got a couple of questions that were submitted in advance, and I'll read them out first, and then we've got questions being fired in nice and quickly, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. Are you okay for about another 20 minutes or so till 12:15?
That'll be grand, yeah. Perfect.
Well, I'll start off with a question that came in from Callum Watkins from Glasgow Community Energy, and he was interested that community energy groups could be key delivery partners with local authority to decarbonise their buildings and transport, but there's no frameworks for procurement of third sector organisations. So his question was, how is the Scottish Government looking to address this shortcoming and also hold local authorities to account on their climate emergency plans?
Okay, so obviously the principal framework that the most recent legislation has given for local authorities to take forward is the local heat and energy efficiency strategies. That's going to be at the heart of a place-based, locally led and locally tailored approach to delivering the transition that we need. And those strategies will underpin the area-based approach to heat and energy efficiency planning. They set out a long-term plan for decarbonising heat and buildings and improving energy efficiency. And we want that to include a real requirement for engagement and joint working with stakeholders, including community groups and the third sector. The regulation requiring those strategies came into force in May this year. Obviously, some local authorities were early adopters with the LT's model and have already taken forward work, but the order sets out a legal requirement for local authorities to produce these strategies and keep on updating them every 5 years. It was developed alongside local government and as part of their legal duty to fulfil the requirements of that order. The Scottish Government is also producing LT's guidance that will set out in more detail what's required of them. So that contains specific requirements in relation to engaging community groups during the development of the local strategies, as well as joint actions for delivery related to both heat and energy efficiency. I think that the underlying point here is that we are only going to really make the progress that's required if people feel that this is a project that we're all part of, rather than just something that's being done to them. So this can't just be seen as something that is a government responsibility any more than it can just be seen as something that's an industry responsibility, as though the market will deliver. I think we all know that that's unrealistic. It has to be something that involves people and involves communities and feels like the collective action that we know will result in this transition being something that people can feel will work for them, rather than just something being done to them.
Thank you for that. And I think LHEs will be key, and it'll be important that we think about how we engage communities and bring them into that process as well. And the next question is a little bit of a technical one about the energy performance certificates, the EPCs. And I suppose the observation is that the EPC is out of date and unable to factor in solutions such as local energy systems and new technologies. What action does the Scottish Government have in the pipeline to address this, and are there any further actions planned?
Yeah, I mean, we agree, and the Heat and Buildings strategy did say that there is a need to reform EPCs, in particular domestic EPCs, and that was the subject of a consultation last year. And for non-domestic buildings as well, we recognise that the ways that we need to make this transition can be difficult to capture. The simple model that's used to produce estimates of energy consumption isn't appropriate. We are aware as well of concerns that EPCs don't encourage the use of zero direct emissions heating systems, and they're not always appropriate for different building types, including historic buildings. The UK government has consulted on setting a minimum energy performance standard based on EPCC, and we're investigating the most effective regulatory approach for the decarbonisation of buildings. You'll be aware that we've talked about the regulations that will be coming in requiring the equivalent of EPCC, and we want that to be communicated to people in a way that is not only relevant to the transition to zero emissions heat, but easy and clear and comprehensible for people to understand. Most people are not going to want to become experts in energy methodology, or we need them to know clearly what it is that they need to do with their buildings, and that's the critical thing. So there's going to be a great deal more work in this area, I think, and it's probably going to continue to be a moving area as technology continues to develop as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. I'm gonna pick one that got a few thumbs up on the next one, and I'm sure you'll be interested in this. Is what support can there be for district heating schemes, and particularly for tenements that aren't suitable for heat pumps, as this might be a way forward?
Yeah, this is a conversation that I've had many times, and yeah, I live on the second floor of a tenement myself. You know, a traditional older Glasgow tenement. It's mixed use, it's mixed tenure. We've got shops on the ground floor because it's on the main road, and trying to create the opportunity to transform the energy performance of a building like that is never something that's going to happen household by household. We need collective approaches, even to the energy efficiency measures in some cases. There are obviously some actions that you can take as an individual householder in a flat, but there's a great deal that we need to do that's going to think about the whole building collectively, and in fact the whole community. I think Glasgow in particular is already very well aware that heat networks are going to be a critically important part of decarbonising that part of our building stock. The legal context is also very complex, and we have a long-term programme of work looking at the legislation that the Law Commission is currently working on. That's not going to be quick and easy. Removing some of the legal barriers to getting this work done is going to be complicated, and there isn't simply a quick way of cutting through that. But I'm absolutely convinced that heat networks are going to be critical, because there's so much of our building stock which simply can't be treated on an individual household by household basis. The condition of our homes is also important, and I think some of the pioneering work that's already been done in Glasgow genuinely shows that you don't necessarily know the condition of these buildings until you start tearing bits off to do the work. And so we have to do that in a way that avoids being so wildly disruptive that people, you know, have to spend ages out of their homes before they can come back in. I think the last thing to say, though, is a little bit like what I was saying earlier about collective community action on climate generally, that it's not just about that direct benefit, it's also about bringing people together and discovering the power of a community when we work together. I think that really applies to tenements as well. I don't want people to think of their tenement as just a wee flat that's one little slice of a box. I want them to be buildings that bring communities together. When that works, the effect can be transformational, not just in the building and energy terms, but in a strengthened community, in the connections between people who share that building. So yeah, this is going to be a long-term challenge. It's not one that can come first in this transition, but where we've got innovators, where we've got people really coming together and finding their own solutions, we need to learn from that, support them, and help to share that. And some of what I mentioned earlier about the fund, which is going to be available for groups of householders to work together, I think will be really relevant to this as well.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and the sort of details about the community heat development programme, we'll get some details on our website over lunchtime for people who are interested in that, and yeah, and it is great to think of them acting as a community, but it is certainly a challenge as well.
Absolutely.
And I'm going to pick the next question, which is, as there may not be an overall energy bill reduction when moving to decarbonised heating from mains gas, are there any plans for longer term government intervention in this area?
Well, obviously the issues around regulation of energy supply sit with the UK government at the moment. We've been making the case for a long time that decoupling the electricity and gas prices is an urgent priority, and it needs to be done if we're going to support that transition away from fossil fuel heating. I think that case is overdue. Even before the current energy price crisis, many people in industry, as well as people advocating for climate action, were saying this is overdue, that the UK government needs to make that change. They have now said that there will be changes there. We still have to see the detail of it. But if we're going to be effective at saying we're generating huge amounts of cheap, green, clean electricity in Scotland, let's allow people to use that and make it affordable for people to use that in heating. That is a question about how energy prices are regulated. We'll continue to make the case for that change as urgently as possible. Of course, there will be those. I don't want to get into the debates for next year at this event, but there will be those who say that if Scotland had the ability to make these choices itself and decide how we would regulate our energy supply, a country with such abundant resources of cheap, green, renewable electricity would be making very different choices on this already. But we absolutely need to support the ability for people to benefit from the affordability of renewable energy rather than paying through the nose as though it's all still being produced from fossil fuels. That's a thing of the past, and we need people to gain that benefit. I think it's really important to say, though, even with the current pricing arrangements, if you have an energy efficient home and a switch to heat pumps, for example, instead of a fossil fuel heating system, it's already becoming comparable in terms of the price because of the extra efficiency of a heat pump, and there'll be other collective sources of heating that can feed into heat networks that can also be very affordable compared with the kind of experience that people have in inefficient homes using gas boilers. So it will continue to improve, the technology will continue to improve, the efficiency and affordability will continue to improve, but the big step change that's required and so far has been missing is decoupling the prices in the UK's approach to energy regulation.
It's a really good answer, and I suppose building on that a little bit, we've got a question in about workforce. And about the requirements to train a workforce to work on the installation, maintenance, and of all these technologies. And there was just a question around what the Scottish Government's doing around sort of, I suppose, reskilling our workforce for low carbon technologies.
Yeah, I suppose three things to say on this. We are working with industry on both supply chain and skills, because it's not going to be enough just to place a requirement on people to decarbonise if the capacity isn't there. That actually would make it even more financially challenging if the capacity isn't there, but the demand is created by regulations. We need to make sure that we're working constructively with industry to make sure that capacity is there. The flip side of that, though, and my second point, is setting those regulations, signalling them well in advance, saying that this work is happening throughout our economy, throughout our built environment, throughout this decade and beyond. That's the signal that industry needs to have confidence to invest. And when I say industry, I mean everything from the big companies that are looking to invest in manufacturing, for example, some of the small independent contractors who, it's understandable that they might want to carry on doing the work that they already know how to do, the work that they're used to, rather than taking the time to invest in reskilling or expanding their capacity into new areas. But we need them to know that there is good quality work, good quality careers to be had in doing this work over decades to come. That's what they need, the confidence that they need if they're going to invest in reskilling in that way. So that schedule of regulations is my second point, about giving confidence in industry to invest. And my third point is, again, about what I mean by industry. I don't just mean those private sector players. I also mean local authorities and RSLs, who could be linchpin, catalyst organisations within communities. They already have in-house capacity in many cases that's dealing with their own building stock. I see no reason why we couldn't encourage and support them to build out their capacity so that they can engage with the wider community that they're part of. and giving leadership within that, so that they become places where those skills are being not only developed but shared out into the wider community. So yeah, it's about working with industry as it stands now. It's about setting that long-term signal about where we're going, so that people have confidence that this is worth investing in. It's also about looking at the capacity that we have in really important catalyst communities that have their roots in communities, that have a sense of trust within communities as well, and looking at how we can make better use of them as I say, as catalyst organisations.
I think that's a great point, and you can sort of see quite easily how, you know, well, housing associations could have that role with the kind of skilled professionals we have within the organisation, and how that might make it easier for people to act.
Absolutely. I mean, I think many of those organisations also haven't necessarily seen themselves as playing a significant role in the energy system in this country, not quite on the same scale as happens in some other European countries. Later this week, I'll be speaking at a Heat Network event, and we'll be sharing some of the experience that we've understood with our relationship with Denmark, for example, where they have much more experience. And you know, if we can share that knowledge, not just within Scotland, but with other countries that have been doing this stuff, which is not rocket science, but they've been doing it for longer, then we'll give those organisations more confidence that they can do this, and it's something that can work alongside their existing core functions, rather than something that distracts from it or undermines their current role.
That's really interesting. It'd be good to sort of see that happen. One of the first questions we got in actually was just thinking about the role of renewable energy as that increases, and an observation that, you know, it is variable, and LNG and natural gas and oil and coal all contribute towards fossil fuel, towards global warming. The question was around, is there a role for nuclear to provide a stable base load, particularly around the small modular reactors? I think I know what your response will be, but
yeah, I mean, it's not where I would be going. It's not where the Scottish Government is going at the moment. And I think, you know, I don't want to say to any other country, especially those that don't have the abundant renewable energy resources that Scotland has, I don't want to say to them that they need to do exactly what we're doing. I think it's for each country to make their own decisions on this. Nuclear, from my point of view, is a more expensive route toward energy supply, certainly a more expensive route toward decarbonisation, and it's a longer term one. We can install not only electricity generation that's low carbon, but also heating systems that are zero direct emissions. We can do that with the existing technologies. We can do that now, and we can do it faster than you would get with nuclear. And also, for Scotland's context, generating capacity for clean electricity, that's not what we're short of. We're going to be seeing huge amounts of both on and offshore wind coming onto the grid. We can generate more from solar as well. As was being said earlier, there's a huge opportunity to look at using excess renewable electricity to generate hydrogen. And I would agree with some of the comments earlier that that's not necessarily about, you know, running it into pipes and burning it in people's boilers, but using it as one of many technologies to store and balance supply and demand, supply against demand within the electricity system. So yeah, we're not short of clean renewable electricity generation. We need to continue to develop it, and for those countries that don't have the renewable resources that we've got, I can understand why some will look at nuclear. But if you look at the installation of energy generating capacity globally, renewables are now becoming dominant. Nuclear has continued to be an element, but it hasn't really been transformational as a technology. Renewables are becoming dominant, and they are squeezing out fossil fuels far more successfully than any other approach. So that's what I think Scotland should continue to commit to, and we can and will make sure that that is a transition that works for everybody, both in terms of economic opportunities from the jobs involved in this transition, but also in terms of affordability and continuing to tackle fuel poverty as best we can.
Thank you for that. Another question that came in, which was, what climate action would you most like to see happen in your community?
Well, I talked about the place that I live already, and I think probably at the top of the list in my own local area. I live in Partick in Glasgow, and you know, these dense urban areas where you have mixed use as well as mixed tenure, it's a real challenge. And if I had one part of this whole agenda where I could wave my magic wand and say let's skip on 10 years, let's do stuff faster, it would probably be that. I do have a real sense of frustration about this whole agenda, in that we only have to use phrases like climate emergency because we shouldn't be where we are now. A lot of this transition should have been 10, 20, 30 years ago, when the climate alarm bells were already ringing. But globally, the fossil fuel industry was pumping out disinformation and conspiracy theories. We should be a lot further ahead than we are now. So let's be under no illusions about that. But the fact remains, you know, we don't have magic wands. We only have real world solutions, and the tenements stuff is I'm afraid going to take longer than it should, longer than I would wish. I think that the last thing to say though is, in some ways, what the actual direct tangible benefit of local community climate action is, that matters of course, but it's only one aspect of what matters. In some ways, the deeper value of collective community climate action is bringing people together, is people discovering their power, and creating the groundswell that will not only result in lifestyle choices or local energy choices or new infrastructure locally, but will result in the appetite for economic and political change that has to come as well. You know, this problem has not been caused by individuals. This problem has not been caused by communities. This problem has been caused by overarching economic systems that have been driving us all in the wrong direction. And so it's only with that groundswell, that appetite for political and economic change, alongside that direct practical infrastructure change, that we're going to be successful. So collective climate action is about creating that expectation for more, not just making individual practical changes on the ground.
Okay, great. And I was just going to suggest one last question. And what we will do is, if there's any questions unanswered, we'll perhaps follow up with some of your colleagues and make sure we get back with responses. There are
always going to be questions unanswered. There'll be many more.
There will be. But yeah, as a last question, will the Scottish Government support local authorities to ensure that it's affordable to install low carbon heating systems in new build schools and other public buildings?
Yeah, we do have funds for public buildings, and are working not just with local authorities, as I said earlier, through the LHES approach, but also working with the industry to make sure that new build standards are improved continuously. Some of the changes to building standards in recent years have, for understandable reasons, had a lot of attention on issues around fire safety and so on in the wake of Grenfell. We have continued to improve on energy, and we have more of a step change coming in the work that we're doing next on building regs, so that new build standards continue to improve, not just in terms of energy efficiency, but the shift away from fossil fuel heating as well. So yeah, both in terms of how we require buildings to be constructed, but also working with local authorities and public services. There's a great deal that we are doing. I'm never going to sit here complacent and say we're doing enough. I need to continue to challenge myself. I need you to continue to challenge me. And the Scottish Government is very conscious that we need to continue to accelerate this change, not just to drive down emissions and continue to tackle fuel poverty as best we can in these difficult times, but to make sure that the whole of our community, the whole of our country feels the benefit of this, rather than it being seen as a burden.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for your presentation and for the excellent responses to questions. It was really good to kind of just hear you talking through some of those issues that came up. So we really enjoyed that.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure. And you know, at this point, it'd be great. You know, normally we do a clap in person, but we'll hopefully we can do a virtual one as well. And thank you for your contribution, because it was really excellent. So thank you very much. And like I say to everyone, we'll dig out any questions that are kind of still there, and we'll look at trying to answer them and circulate the responses to make sure we address them. I've got just a couple of housekeeping points just before we finish up for lunch. This will actually be the last time I speak to everybody today, because everybody's going to separate into their how-to workshops and work a little more focused and have that opportunity to interact and share your thoughts and discuss things. So we will be sending out a post-conference survey, so please do fill it in and let us know what's kind of worked well for you and what you'd like to see more of for next time. We're also interested to know whether or not you'd want an in-person event or a remote event. Again, obviously the remote's easier to travel to, but we miss talking to everybody. Sue made that point earlier. But we'd like your feedback on what works best for you. And we will send you an email later today, later in the week, with the survey and some follow-up things. In terms of this afternoon's how-to sessions, please come along. If you could join just before 1:30, that would be great. So you've got a decent lunch, because I appreciate this has been a long session. Come back just before 1:30 and pick whichever you want. In the introductory email you were sent, you'll have the link for the session, your first session. Just pick one of those and join that. But apart from that, I'd like to close now for the morning session. I'd like to really thank all the speakers and contributors from this morning. It's been great, and thank you for all the kind of good questions, and we'll see you straight into your how-to sessions at 1:30. So thank you very much, everyone.